If your freedom is dependent upon you having the facts to make informed choices, which is the premise of democracy, then if you're organized crime trying to operate at scale, then what you want to do is dominate those in-between domains. Wolf Blitzer on CNN being a classic case in point. Judith Miller at the New York Times, again, being a classic case in point. I called the book Guilt by Association because if you're waging war in the shared field of consciousness, that's where a consensus resides, is in that shared field. You know, sort of a belief that we share, but you can't really touch, smell, or see that domain. If you're shaping that consensus beliefs, the way this criminality operates at scale is the people that are the criminals in this operation are very masterful at displacing facts with what the mark, the targeted populace, can be induced to believe is true. You remember Iraqi ties to Al-Qaeda. Remember Iraq was having meetings in Prague with Taliban. You remember the yellow cake uranium from Niger. You remember the mobile biological weapons laboratories. You remember the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had. If you look back, all of those were false. Yet we had a consensus that they were true. That is how organized crime operates at scale now. It displaces the facts essential for informed choice with pre-cooked intelligence to have you embrace certain beliefs that in this case took us to war in the Middle East. So that's organized crime operating at a global scale. That's how it operates, displacing facts with what the mark, meaning the United States populace, could be induced to believe is true. So the scope of this criminality, and I think that's the right phrase for it, is substantial. If you can imagine, for example, embedding in a shared field of consciousness, where does this consensus reside that indeed Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, all the sorts of intelligence we know were fixed to take us to war in Iraq. At what level does this criminality have to operate in order to deceive at least a critical mass of people in the Congress and in the general population that we go along with this and say, yes, of course, we believe in all this, therefore let's go to war in Iraq, which of course had absolutely nothing, as we now know, to do with 9/11. So what's the scale at which this operates? Very, very large scale. That's why this syndicate needed to really have a critical mass of dominance in what we call mainstream media and other key in-between domains. If you're trying to have a form of governance based on facts versus what you can be induced to believe, then you need to dominate those in-between domains. You need to have a substantial critical mass of influence, and primarily in media, print media, but also the visual media, particularly the networks, in order to induce us to believe things that simply were not true. So what is the scope of this? The scope is vast. The scope is very large. The only thing I can identify in this modus operandi, and again, the modus operandi is a Latin term, means a method of operating, is how do you displace facts, the facts essential for informed choice, with beliefs, fictions, to have the mark, the target, a targeted populace, sincerely believe that these things are true, sufficiently true that we would expend our blood and treasure, we would put our youth in our military, we would deploy our military on behalf of this fiction. So who would have the capacity to do that, and who would have the state of mind to do that other than a criminal syndicate? And that's why I call this a criminal syndicate. Some people call this Zionism. I think it's frankly more sinister than that. It is a criminal syndicate. How do you get the nation, the world's largest superpower, to go to war for you, for your agenda, to advance your expansionist agenda? How do you do that? That's game theory. Let's talk for a minute about assets and how they operate in the political domain. John McCain is a classic what we call asset, and that's, again, there's a terminology here that you need to be familiar with to understand how criminality can operate in plain sight yet non-transparently and so far with legal impunity. An asset is someone who's been profiled in sufficient depth that if you put them in a time, place, and circumstance, you know within an acceptable range of probabilities that they will perform consistent with their personality profile. That's called an asset. To some extent, we're all assets, but political operatives like a John McCain, you need to know that they'll perform within an acceptable range of, probabilities. He is a classic asset. I live in Tempe, Arizona, which was a congressional district created in part to help run him for Congress 4 years before an earlier maverick, Barry Goldwater, was known to be planning his retirement. But John McCain, his background, and it's in guilt by association, his background requires a little bit of explanation. There's a fellow named Gus Greenbaum who was sent out to Arizona in 1928. In 1947, a fellow named Bugsy Siegel, who was widely known as an operative, was killed by Murder, Inc., which is the enforcement arm of organized crime, because he was caught skimming the casino skim. And you may remember Virginia Hill, his dancer friend, better known as Flamingo, was her dance name. There was a casino there called the Flamingo, which Bugsy named after his Virginia Hill, a famous story in sort of mobster lore. When Bugsy was murdered, they need someone to replace him in Las Vegas. That became Gus Greenbaum. He moved to Las Vegas in 1947 to take over from Bugsy. But then the mob needed someone to replace Bugsy Siegel. That was a fellow named Kemper Marley, who in effect had a statewide liquor monopoly that came largely from the Bronfman family, the founders of the World Jewish Congress, out of Ontario. They were the primary importers of booze during the Prohibition. Kemper Marley, in effect, got that liquor monopoly from the Bronfman family. Kemper Marley became the replacement for Gus Greenbaum. He hired two fellows, both named Hensley. James Hensley and his brother, in effect, took the fall. They took the heat for two federal liquor violations that Kemper Marley otherwise would have been prosecuted for. In that process, James Hensley came into the ownership of an Anheuser-Busch distributorship, which is now the 5th largest beer distributorship in the United States. Cindy Hensley, his daughter, 18 years John McCain's junior. If you understand John McCain and know what an asset is, if you got this Cindy Hensley in John McCain's neighborhood, you knew within an acceptable range of probability that the sparks would fly. And sure enough, John McCain ends up divorcing his wife, moving to Arizona, and becoming a public relations person for Hensley Distributors, the beer distributorship. With that, he works himself into politics and is run for the Congress in '81. 4 years later is run for the Senate. He's 82 to the Congress, I guess. 4 years later comes into the Senate as a perfect asset. When Cindy meets him, he is a Navy liaison to the Senate. He's already gone to Israel with Richard Pearl and this other crowd who by then profiled him as a classic, a very reliable and pliable asset. So John McCain, again, an absolute classic asset. There's hard to find a more classic asset than John McCain, with the possible exception of John Kyle, who is the Christian Zionist, again from Arizona, again a state that's been widely dominated by organized crime for a very long time. That's why Janet Napolitano is now head of Homeland Security. Again, a very reliable sort of asset from a state that has been dominated by organized crime since no later than the 1920s. So that's John McCain. Keep in mind that he proposed campaign finance reform as a way to recover his reputation when he was the primary advocate for what was known as the Keating Five, which was a group that was helped delay the reform of the savings and loan fraud of the late 1980s. That delay helped raise the cost of that financial fraud from $100 billion to about $150 billion. So we have John McCain and his colleagues to thank for that as well. That's John McCain. In the book, I cover the attack on the USS Liberty, which is an intelligence ship which in June of 1967 was attacked and savaged by the Israeli Air Force, the Israeli Navy. It was covered up by Lyndon Johnson and John McCain's father, who was then the admiral with oversight of that particular region. So it's sort of, like father, like son. Had that not been covered up in 1967, we would not consider Israel to be the ally that we've been induced to believe that it is, despite the facts. So again, I won't get into that now, but it's in the book. There's a long chapter on the USS Liberty, which is online. It's on the Criminal State website. You can just click on it there. No matter how honest you are as a politician, you are disabled by your own biases, okay? And you're disabled by the intelligence on which you rely. In the case of George W. Bush, recovering alcoholic, so you've got that thing about an outer authority, give your life up to an outer authority, which immediately makes you vulnerable. You've got, he's out of sorts with his father, who's a pretty smart guy, so he's not talking to his father, who had a lot of background that would have been useful for him to have in making these decisions. You're surrounded by this crowd. You're a Christian Zionist, you're a born-again Christian, so you've got a substantially long list of personality profile characteristics whereby you know that if some emotionally wrenching event like a 9/11 occurs, you know within an acceptable range of probabilities, particularly based on the fixed intelligence funneled into the decisions, what the decision is going to be. That's game theory. People routinely ask about 9/11 and what was its role in this scenario that is laid out in Criminal State. I said if you've got 1.3 billion Muslims worldwide, roughly, you've got 6 decades of abuse and indignities heaped upon Muslims, particularly in Palestine, but elsewhere, by a enclave of extremists who are viewed as an ally of the United States. We routinely arm them. We veto resolutions to discipline them in the UN. We are seen as a loyal ally of the what people call the State of Israel. Is it difficult with an agent provocateur model that is that spans decades? How difficult would it be to get a critical mass of people enough upset at us that they would make a point? And if you're trying to, with that point, provoke a provocation, then what better thing to do than to hit some iconic buildings such as the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, something like that, knowing within an acceptable range of probabilities that we're likely to respond by going to war. And once you have that provocation in place, how difficult is it to fix the intelligence so that instead of mobilizing, say, a police action to go after Al-Qaeda, to arrest or kill those who were complicit in this, instead go as a nation to war against Iraq, which had nothing to do with this. So that's another sort of, when you're understanding how game theory works and game theory war planning, particularly when you have multi-generational agent provocateur operations underway, is that an explanation of 9/11? Well, all I can do is sort of report the facts and let people draw their own conclusions, but those are the facts. The goal of the Criminal State series, beginning with guilt by association, is to help people understand how facts can be displaced with fictions, with beliefs, in plain view. And one great example of that is the deployment of Colin Powell to the UN to testify to the veracity of Iraq having mobile biological weapons laboratories. Now, that was done in February 2005, just before the invasion. And when you were looking at Colin Powell, you thought you were looking at Colin Powell. You weren't really. What was being deployed there was the credibility of Colin Powell. When you're waging war in this sort of shared field of consciousness, you're always deploying the properties that are embedded in that field. In this particular case, you were associating Colin Powell's credibility with this fixed, false, and phony intelligence, which is mobile biological weapons laboratories. By associating his credibility with this fixed intelligence, you have what's called in psychology a bleed over. Suddenly you took his credibility and that made this fixed intelligence appear credible. So that's how you wage war in the field of consciousness, with the power of association.